What if I told you that right now, at this very moment, you're living in a prison? Not a physical one with iron bars and concrete walls, but something far more insidious. A prison of perception so seamlessly constructed that you've never even noticed its existence. This mental confinement shapes every thought you have, every decision you make, and every emotion you feel, yet remains completely invisible to you. Think about it. When was the last time you genuinely questioned not just what you believe, but how you came to believe it? When did you last examine the fundamental frameworks through which you interpret everything around you? For most of us, the honest answer is never. And in that blind spot lies the nature of our captivity. Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, understood this prison better than anyone. Over 2,000 years ago, he crafted what might be the most profound metaphor for human existence ever conceived, the allegory of the cave. But rather than simply recounting his allegory, I want to reveal how this ancient wisdom illuminates the modern mind-forged manacles most of us never realize we're wearing. A renowned neuropsychologist once stated, "Most people would rather die than think, and many do." This isn't hyperbole. The unwillingness to examine our mental frameworks doesn't just limit our potential. It fundamentally constrains our experience of reality itself. We don't see things as they are. We see them as we are. Consider how your smartphone subtly shapes your perception of the world. Every notification, every curated feed, every algorithm-selected piece of content doesn't just inform you, it forms you. It constructs neural pathways that determine what you notice and what remains invisible to you. Yet, how often do you step back and recognize this influence? The technology we believe serves us has, in many ways, become our master, determining the boundaries of our mental landscape without our awareness. The most frightening aspect of this confinement isn't the limitations themselves, it's our complete blindness to them. As David Foster Wallace famously illustrated, there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" The water we swim in, our unexamined assumptions, inherited beliefs, and cultural programming, remains invisible precisely because it's everywhere. It's not one belief among many. It's the medium through which all other beliefs are formed and evaluated. What keeps us trapped in these mental prisons? I've identified three powerful forces, what I call the invisible wardens, that maintain our confinement without our knowledge or consent. The first warden is cognitive momentum. Human minds aren't designed for truth-seeking. They're designed for efficiency. Once our brains establish neural pathways for interpreting reality, altering those pathways requires enormous energy. This creates a powerful inertia that keeps us thinking along familiar lines, even when those thought patterns no longer serve us or accurately represent reality. A cognitive neuroscientist explained it to me this way. Your brain operates on the principle of minimum viable awareness. It constructs just enough of a model of reality for functional navigation, then filters out anything that doesn't fit that model. This efficiency serves us well for basic survival, but catastrophically limits our access to deeper truths. The second warden is social convergence. As profoundly social creatures, we unconsciously align our perceptions with those around us. Studies at Stanford University revealed that people will deny the evidence of their own eyes to maintain group harmony. This isn't weakness, it's the natural functioning of a social brain evolved in environments where rejection meant death. The need to belong is more fundamental than the need to be right, a social psychologist once explained to me. When forced to choose between social acceptance and accuracy, most people's minds will automatically sacrifice accuracy without them even realizing it's happening. The third warden, perhaps most powerful of all, is existential terror. Confronting the limitations of our mental frameworks isn't just intellectually challenging, it's emotionally devastating. Our sense of self is constructed from the very beliefs and perceptual patterns that constitute our prison. Questioning them feels, at a neurological level, like death. A former fundamentalist described his experience of questioning his religious framework. It wasn't just challenging an idea, it felt like my entire self was dissolving. The terror was so profound that my body responded as if I were literally dying. This visceral fear keeps most people safely within their mental confines, unconsciously avoiding questions that might lead to this dissolution. These wardens don't operate through force, but through subtle influence, making their power nearly impossible to detect. They don't prevent you from thinking certain thoughts. They shape which thoughts feel natural, comfortable, and obvious, and which feel threatening, uncomfortable, or simply don't occur to you at all. Our mental prisons aren't haphazard constructions. They have distinctive architectures, built from specific materials and following recognizable patterns. Understanding these structures is the first step toward liberation. The foundation of every mental prison is language itself. The words available to you literally determine what you can think. As linguist Benjamin Lee Horff demonstrated, people who speak languages with different structures perceive reality differently, not as a matter of opinion, but as a matter of what their consciousness can access. A polyglot friend once shared, "When I think in Japanese versus English, I'm not just translating, I'm accessing different parts of myself and perceiving different aspects of reality. Each language creates possibilities while foreclosing others. Your native tongue is both a window and a wall, revealing some aspects of reality while concealing others." Built upon this linguistic foundation are conceptual frameworks, the organizing principles through which you interpret experience. These aren't just what you think, but how you think. Some people perceive through materialist frameworks, others through spiritual ones, still others through ancestral or traditional lenses. Each framework illuminates certain aspects of reality while rendering others literally imperceptible. A quantum physicist once explained, "The mathematics I use daily describes a reality so different from our intuitive experience that it's not just difficult to understand, it's difficult to believe, even for me. Yet, the evidence confirms it's true." Our intuitive frameworks, evolved for navigating middle-world experiences, actively prevent us from perceiving aspects of reality that don't fit their parameters. The walls of your mental prison consist of emotional attachments to specific beliefs. The stronger your emotional investment in a perspective, the more impenetrable that wall becomes. These attachments aren't primarily intellectual, but identity-based. Challenging them feels like an attack on who you fundamentally are. A political activist described his awakening. "I realized I wasn't evaluating information objectively. I was unconsciously filtering everything through whether it supported or threatened my political identity. Evidence that contradicted my views didn't just seem wrong, it felt personally threatening. This emotional architecture explains why presenting contradictory evidence often strengthens rather than weakens entrenched beliefs, a phenomenon psychologists call the backfire effect. The ceiling of your mental prison, what prevents you from seeing beyond your current perception, is composed of what philosophers call unknown unknowns. These aren't simply facts you haven't learned, but entire domains of reality your current framework doesn't allow you to recognize even exist. As one epistemologist put it, the truly limiting factor isn't what you don't know, it's what you don't know you don't know. Consider how many ancient civilizations had no concept of bacteria or viruses. It wasn't that they knew about these organisms, but had incorrect theories. The entire conceptual category was absent from their cognitive architecture. What equivalent blind spots exist in your current understanding? By definition, you cannot know until you've transcended your current framework. Plato's ancient allegory begins with people chained in a cave, able to see nothing but shadows projected on a wall. They mistake these shadows for reality itself, having never experienced anything else. Our modern cave is infinitely more sophisticated, but operates on the same principle, mistaking representations for reality. Today's shadows aren't cast by firelight, but by screens that mediate our experience of the world. Consider how much of what you know comes not from direct experience, but from digital representations, news feeds, social media, search results, and entertainment, all filtered through proprietary algorithms designed not for truth-seeking, but for engagement maximization. A former tech executive confided, "The goal was never to connect people with reality, but to connect them with content that would keep them engaged. The most effective way to do that is to reinforce existing beliefs while creating the illusion of exploration. This digital architecture doesn't just distort reality, it constructs a simulation so compelling, we forget we're experiencing a mediated reality rather than direct contact with the world. The chains in our modern cave aren't physical, but attentional. The average person now spends over 7 hours daily looking at screens, with their attention captured, directed, and monetized by entities whose interests often conflict with their well-being. As one attention economist noted, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. Specifically, your attention and cognitive resources are the product being sold. What makes this modern imprisonment so perfect is its invisibility. The ancient cave dwellers were physically chained. We are neurologically tethered through dopamine-driven feedback loops that create the illusion of freedom while ensuring our continued captivity. Each notification, like an auto-playing video, strengthens these tethers without our awareness or consent. Most disturbingly, we've become willing participants in our own imprisonment. We eagerly purchase the latest devices, download the newest apps, and integrate these attention-capturing technologies ever more deeply into our lives. As media theorist Marshall McLuhan observed, we shape our tools, and thereafter, our tools shape us. The digital architecture we've constructed is now reconstructing our neural architecture, altering how we think, feel, and perceive at the most fundamental levels. Living in a mental prison might seem harmless, after all. If everyone's doing it, how bad can it be? But the costs, both individual and collective, are immense and growing. At the individual level, mental confinement creates a peculiar form of suffering, what philosophers call alienation. This isn't just unhappiness, but a profound disconnection from reality, others, and even yourself. When your perceptual frameworks don't align with actuality, you experience life as inherently unsatisfying without understanding why. As one existential psychologist put it, depression is often the mind's response to living according to maps that don't match the territory. A former executive described his experience, "I had achieved everything society told me would bring fulfillment, wealth, status, power, yet I felt hollow, like I was living someone else's life. Only when my mental frameworks collapsed during a personal crisis did I realize how confined my perception had been." This alienation manifests as the epidemic of meaning deficiency plaguing affluent societies. People have comfort but lack purpose, connection, and authenticity. At the collective level, society itself becomes dysfunctional when composed of people living in incompatible mental realities. Political polarization isn't just disagreement about solutions, but fundamental divergence in how people perceive reality itself. As one conflict resolution specialist explained, we're not having arguments within a shared framework. We're experiencing entirely different realities, using the same words to describe completely different perceptual worlds. This perceptual fragmentation prevents us from addressing existential challenges requiring coordinated action. Climate change, technological risks, and resource depletion demand responses based on shared understanding of reality. When perception itself becomes polarized, collective action becomes impossible, threatening civilization's sustainability. Perhaps most troublingly, mental confinement prevents authentic human connection. True relationship requires genuine presence, the ability to perceive another person as they are, rather than as a projection of your own frameworks. As Martin Buber observed, most interactions remain at the level of I-it, rather than I-thou. We relate to projections, rather than persons. This explains the paradoxical loneliness many experience despite unprecedented technological connectivity. The ultimate price of continued confinement may be the stunting of human potential itself. As Maslow and other developmental psychologists documented, human consciousness can evolve through multiple stages, each transcending the limitations of the previous while integrating its strengths. Mental prisons prevent this evolution, trapping potential sages in the equivalent of psychological adolescence, unable to access the more expansive perceptual capacities that constitute mature human awareness. How can you determine if you're living in a mental prison? Unlike physical confinement, mental imprisonment leaves subtle but detectable signs for those willing to look. The first sign is emotional reactivity to contradictory information. When presented with facts or perspectives that challenge your existing frameworks, do you feel a surge of anger, anxiety, or dismissiveness? This emotional response isn't rational evaluation, but your prison's defense system activating. As one cognitive scientist explained, strong emotional reactions to information are often indicators that unconscious belief protection mechanisms have engaged. The second sign is certainty without investigation. Do you hold strong opinions on complex topics you haven't personally studied in depth? This borrowed certainty indicates you have internalized frameworks without examining them. A philosopher friend noted, the correlation between certainty and actual knowledge is often inverse. Those who truly understand complexity embrace uncertainty. Those who don't cling to certainty. The third sign is homogeneity of information sources. If your understanding comes primarily from sources that share your existing perspective, you're likely in a perceptual echo chamber. Information diversity isn't just about political variation, but exposing yourself to fundamentally different ways of making meaning. As one epistemologist observed, the question isn't whether your sources lean left or right, but whether they all share the same underlying assumptions about what constitutes reality itself. The fourth sign is difficulty articulating the strongest arguments against your position. Can you steelman opposing perspectives, presenting them so fairly that those who hold them would agree with your characterization? If not, you're likely seeing caricatures rather than engaging with actual alternative frameworks. A debate champion told me, "You don't understand your own position until you understand the best arguments against it well enough to make them yourself." The fifth and perhaps most telling sign is the absence of evolution in your fundamental beliefs. If your core frameworks haven't significantly changed in years or decades, you're likely not growing, but calcifying. True intellectual development isn't just accumulating information within a framework, but periodically transcending and transforming the framework itself. As psychologist Robert Kegan noted, true growth isn't learning new facts, but developing more complex ways of knowing. Examine your own experience for these signs. Their presence doesn't mean you're uniquely flawed. It means you're human, subject to the same perceptual limitations that affect us all. Recognition of confinement is the essential first step toward liberation. Plato didn't just diagnose our imprisonment, he prescribed a pathway to freedom. While his original allegory focused on philosophical education, the underlying principles can be adapted for modern minds seeking liberation from contemporary confinements. The first stage of liberation is disillusionment, recognizing that what you've accepted as reality is a limited representation. This recognition typically doesn't arrive through intellectual analysis, but through encountering anomalies, experiences your current framework cannot adequately explain. As philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn observed, paradigm shifts begin not with new theories, but with the accumulation of anomalies that existing theories cannot accommodate. a former religious fundamentalist, described his journey. It wasn't arguments that changed me. It was encountering genuine goodness in people my framework told me were evil. This created a cognitive dissonance I couldn't resolve within my existing belief system. These anomalies create cracks in the prison walls, opportunities for light to enter from beyond your current perception. The second stage involves cultivating epistemic humility, a deep recognition of the limitations of human knowledge in general and your understanding in particular. This isn't self-deprecation, but accurate assessment of cognitive capacity. As evolutionary biologist Stuart Kauffman noted, the universe is not only stranger than we suppose, it is stranger than we can suppose. True humility isn't thinking less of your intelligence, but recognizing the inherent constraints of any single perspective. Practical exercises for developing this humility include studying cognitive biases, examining historical cases where consensus views proved catastrophically wrong, and deliberately seeking exposure to paradigms that contradict your fundamental assumptions. A theoretical physicist stated, "I read ancient mystical texts not because I believe them literally, but because they remind me that reality may be far stranger than my equations suggest." The third stage requires developing perceptual flexibility, the ability to temporarily adopt alternative frameworks to see what they reveal. This goes beyond intellectual understanding to actual perception. Just as learning a new language allows you to think thoughts previously unavailable to you, adopting different perceptual frameworks reveals aspects of reality your native framework filters out. Anthropologists practice this through immersion in foreign cultures, temporarily suspending their cultural frameworks to experience reality through different meaning-making systems. Spiritual practitioners achieve similar flexibility through contemplative practices that suspend ordinary perception. As one Zen teacher expressed it, enlightenment isn't gaining a new understanding, but removing the obstacles to seeing what was always there. The fourth stage involves integration, developing meta-awareness that can hold multiple frameworks simultaneously without being captured by any single perspective. This isn't relativism, claiming all views are equally valid, but perspectivism, recognizing that different views reveal different aspects of a complex reality. As philosopher Ken Wilber observed, the truth is not in any territory, but in the map of these territories that includes them all. A Supreme Court justice states, "My job isn't to decide which side is absolutely right. It's to understand how each perspective reveals different aspects of justice that need integration." This capacity to synthesize multiple valid but partial perspectives characterizes the most developed human minds across disciplines. The final stage is ongoing practice, recognizing that liberation isn't a destination but a continuous process of expanding awareness. No matter how evolved your perception becomes, it remains finite, capturing some aspects of reality while missing others. As philosopher Karl Popper emphasized, knowledge advances not by proving frameworks correct, but by continually falsifying and refining them through rigorous testing against reality. A spiritual teacher expressed this beautifully. There is no final awakening, only ever-deepening cycles of awakening, integration, and further awakening. The journey has no end because reality has no bottom. This ongoing practice transforms liberation from a goal to be achieved into a way of being in continuous evolution. What freedom looks like. What characterizes consciousness that has begun to transcend its initial confinement? While complete liberation may remain an asymptotic goal, minds that have significantly expanded beyond their original constraints display recognizable qualities. First is cognitive fluidity, the ability to move between different ways of knowing without becoming fixed in any single mode. This manifests as comfort with both analytical and intuitive thinking, both objective measurement and subjective experience, both rational discourse and embodied wisdom. As one polymath described it, I don't experience these as competing approaches, but as complementary instruments in an orchestra, each revealing different aspects of the symphony. Second is comfort with paradox, the capacity to hold seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously without forcing premature resolution. This isn't intellectual sloppiness, but recognition of reality's inherent complexity. Quantum physicists develop this capacity by working with phenomena that behave as both particles and waves simultaneously. Spiritual traditions cultivate it through koans and teaching stories that deliberately short-circuit linear thinking to access non-dual awareness. A Tibetan Buddhist teacher explained, "The Western mind typically tries to resolve paradox through either-or thinking. The liberated mind embraces both and awareness, recognizing that apparent contradictions often reflect the limitations of conceptual thinking rather than problems with reality itself." Third is epistemic playfulness, approaching knowledge with both seriousness and lightness. This combines deep commitment to truth-seeking with humility about the provisional nature of all human knowledge. It manifests as willingness to revise even long-held positions when evidence warrants, without experiencing this revision as threat or failure. A renowned scientific researcher described his approach. "I'm deeply committed to my hypotheses while working with them, but I hold them lightly enough to celebrate their falsification. Being proven wrong means I've learned something, which is cause for excitement rather than defensiveness." This combination of commitment and detachment characterizes minds that prioritize truth over ego protection. Fourth is psychological spaciousness, a sense of identity expansive enough to transcend identification with specific beliefs or frameworks. This doesn't mean abandoning conviction, but recognizing that you are not your beliefs. As one contemplative philosopher put it, your opinions are furniture in the room of your awareness, not the room itself. A meditation teacher described this shift. "Before awakening, I was my thoughts. After awakening, I have thoughts." This creates freedom to think clearly without the distortion of existential attachment to particular outcomes. This psychological spaciousness allows for authentic intellectual integrity, following evidence wherever it leads without identity-based resistance. Fifth is embodied knowing, recognition that understanding isn't confined to conceptual thinking, but includes bodily wisdom, emotional intelligence, and intuitive insight. Liberated consciousness integrates these multiple ways of knowing, rather than privileging rational cognition alone. As philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasized, we are not minds that have bodies, but embodied beings whose cognition emerges from physical existence. A somatic therapist explained, "Your body processes millions of data points below conscious awareness. Learning to access this embodied wisdom doesn't bypass rationality but complements it with information unavailable to conceptual thinking alone." This integration creates knowing that's both more comprehensive and more reliable than purified rationality or raw intuition in isolation. These qualities aren't exotic or mysterious, but natural expressions of consciousness freed from unnecessary constraints. They represent not superhuman abilities, but the fuller functioning of capacities already present within you, awaiting liberation from the confinements that suppress them. Why undertake this challenging journey? What becomes possible when enough people begin transcending their mental confinements? The personal benefits are significant: greater clarity, reduced suffering, more authentic relationships, and access to expanded dimensions of experience. But the collective implications may prove even more profound. Many of humanity's existential challenges result from fragmented perception. Our inability to recognize interconnection between phenomena, our limited frameworks categorize as separate, economic systems that ignore ecological impacts, technologies developed without ethical foresight, and social policies that address symptoms rather than systemic causes all reflect this fragmentation. As physicist David Bohm noted, thought divides everything up into fragments. That's how thought works, but reality is whole. A sustainable civilization requires integrative awareness, capable of perceiving complex interdependencies and making decisions that account for systemic impacts across traditionally separated domains. As one systems scientist expressed it, the key predictions that will determine humanity's future lie not within any specialized discipline, but in the interplay between them, precisely where our fragmented expertise leaves us blind. Beyond sustainability lies the possibility of human flourishing. Societies organized to facilitate development of our highest potentials, rather than merely satisfying basic needs or manufacturing artificial desires. Developmental psychologists like Claire Graves, Robert Keegan, and Suzanne Cook-Greuter have mapped the further reaches of human possibility, documenting capacities for meaning-making, ethical reasoning, and perspectival sophistication far beyond conventional adult development. A developmental researcher shared her finding. Most adults stop developing at conventional stages not because they've reached the limits of human potential, but because their social environments neither demand nor support further growth. Creating conditions that facilitate continued development could unlock collective intelligence and compassion, currently unavailable to societies composed primarily of minds confined to conventional perception. Most profoundly, liberation from mental prisons may enable genuine communion, a connection that transcends the limitations of egocentric consciousness. As philosopher Martin Buber observed, authentic. Thou relationships become possible only when we recognize the other, not as an object within our perceptual framework, but as a distinct center of consciousness with whom we share reality. This authentic meeting cannot occur between minds trapped in rigid frameworks that objectify everything they encounter. A spiritual teacher described this possibility. When two people meet beyond their conceptual prisons, something emerges that transcends both individual consciousnesses while excluding neither. This communion is what all humans ultimately seek, though most look for it in places it cannot be found. This quality of connection, simultaneously transcendent and immanent, universal and deeply personal, represents what religious traditions have variously termed salvation, enlightenment, or awakening. You stand now at a choice point. Having glimpsed the nature of your confinement, will you retreat to the familiar comfort of limitation, or will you embark on the challenging but rewarding journey toward greater freedom? The path of liberation isn't easy. It requires courage to question what you've always taken for granted, humility to recognize how much remains beyond your current perception, and persistence to continue when the journey becomes disorienting. As philosopher Søren Kierkegaard observed, there is nothing with which every man is so afraid as getting to know how enormously much he is capable of. Yet the alternative, remaining confined in increasingly dysfunctional mental models while pretending to see clearly, ultimately creates greater suffering than the challenges of growth. As psychiatrist R.D. Laing put it, the range of what we think and do is limited by what we fail to notice. And because we fail to notice that we fail to notice, there is little we can do to change until we notice how failing to notice shapes our thoughts and deeds. Begin with simple practices. Set aside time daily to question one assumption you typically take for granted. Seek out perspectives that challenge your existing frameworks, not to refute them, but to understand what they reveal that your current perception misses. Practice cognitive empathy by genuinely attempting to see issues through entirely different worldviews. Develop mindfulness that allows you to observe your own thinking processes rather than being captured by them. Remember that liberation occurs gradually through consistent practice rather than through sudden transformation. Each small expansion of awareness creates conditions for further growth. As author Anaïs Nin beautifully expressed it, the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. What aspects of reality might await your discovery beyond the prison of your current perception? What deeper connections might become possible? What contributions might you make from an expanded awareness? What would it mean to perceive yourself, others, and the world not through inherited limitations, but through progressively liberating clarity? If something in this perspective has shifted your understanding, share it with someone else who might benefit. After all, individual liberation ultimately leads toward collective awakening, a humanity capable of perceiving and responding to reality with wisdom rather than reactivity, with compassion rather than fear, with creativity rather than repetition of established patterns. What mental prison might you be living in without realizing it? What beliefs feel too sacred or obvious to question? What would happen if you temporarily suspended these certainties and looked at life through entirely different eyes? I'd love to hear your experiences with questioning your fundamental assumptions in the comments. Your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to begin their own path to freedom.